Baltimore City State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby says she should be held to account for the results in the courtroom, all while doubling down on her progressive prosecution policies that some critics say are resulting in a sense of lawlessness across the city. We're seeing some progressive prosecutors get recalled across the country, potentially spelling trouble for Mosby in Baltimore. Dirt bikers ripping through the streets, squeegee workers assaulting drivers, open-air drug markets, shootings, and homicides, all on the rise in Baltimore City. While City State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby doubling down on her policies to ignore low-level crimes.
Decriminalized maybe small players who could grow into larger players.
Meanwhile, the town prosecutor in another largely Democratic city, San Francisco, recalled, with policies like Mosby of not prosecuting low-level crimes, with a strong message from voters across the country. Does that concern you at all and worry you heading into this election season, given what we saw voters decide there?
And unfortunately, they didn't follow the data that actually crime was going down in San Francisco. But I will say, no, it's not discouraging. It's unfortunate, but we are still very much pushing forward.
Surging crime in San Francisco not going ignored by the voters there.
We are seeing very similar things happen here. Should voters ignore that?
So what I can tell you is that in San Francisco, there were about 84,000 people that elected him and put him into office. And then there were another, like less than 64,000 that removed him. And so, I don't think that it's indicative of what's happening here.
Mosby often touting a Johns Hopkins study on her prosecution policies, using the data to prop up her plans. It looked at 741 people whose prostitution or drug possession charges were dismissed, finding less than 1% of them went on to commit more serious crimes, but also saying further evidence was needed. Sean Kennedy with the Maryland Public Policy Institute says not going after lower-level crimes could be missed opportunities.
For people who are larger players who would have smaller minor crimes tagged against them that could be used as leverage.
But my job as a prosecutor is when you hold me accountable in the courtroom.
Just last month, the jury delivered a loss to Mosby in the high-profile murder trial for the man accused of killing Safe Streets worker Dante Barksdale. The jury acquitting Garrick Powell, who has a record of drug possession charges, something Mosby no longer prosecuting. Thursday afternoon, pressing the mayor about the policies.
Do you think that the policies are sending a bad message to the city, though? We're seeing carjackings up, assaults are on the rise, and a lot of that is what we saw in San Francisco, and that's what voters there were concerned
Baltimore
about.
and San Francisco, Mackenzie, are two different places. Well, I think we'll see what the voters of Baltimore want to see, because they're going to make that decision in a little over a month.
You're a voter. How do you feel about it?
For me, I'm a voter, but I'm also an executive. I'm a leader. And leaders don't get emotional. Leaders don't go about favoritism. Leaders do the work of working with everybody. I think my record proves that I can work with people across party lines, across the political spectrum. So the voters' will is what I will follow as always.
Meanwhile, Governor Larry Hogan, a Republican, not mincing words.
Do you think that it's time for those policies to change here in Baltimore City, and should voters take notice?
Well, absolutely they should take notice, and it's very similar. Unfortunately, Baltimore doesn't have the ability to do any kind of a removal process like they could do in San Francisco.
There is an election in July.
There is an election in July, and I think voters ought to take notice, and they ought to take a look. I mean, obviously, I've supported through Vignaraja, even though he's of a different party than I am. It's an unprecedented move, but I just said, there's one guy that wants to talk about getting tough on criminals, violent criminals, and that's the only one. The current prosecutor is failing.
Now, despite Marilyn Mosby's own federal indictment, she says she remains confident that voters will stand behind her in the primary, which is slated for July 19th. In Annapolis, Mackenzie Frost, Fox 45 News.